And now, welcome to this session.
This session demonstrates how to create efficient API endpoints for direct database access without custom backend logic. He will also teach how to use REST or GraphQL, enabling developers to build dynamic, data-driven applications, thereby enhancing workflow and application performance. A Microsoft Azure MVP and community lead of Angular Philippines, our next speaker is passionate about web development and helping businesses turn ideas into reality. When not coding, he's busy building his own tech business. A senior full-stack developer at Flextools based in Norway. Let's make some virtual noise for Mr. Jezreel Maghuyak.
Um, I'm currently working as a senior full stack developer here in Norway. And I'm also one of the few Microsoft Azure MVP in the Philippines and one of the community lead for Angular Philippines, where we do seminars and workshops. Um, yeah, so the topic today that I'll be discussing is about simplifying database integration in Angular with Azure Static Web Apps. So I'm not sure if you can see the poll I created. Um, so just to give me an idea what my audience right now is using, especially in the front end framework and their like preferred database or the cloud provider they're using. So yeah, just feel free to fill up the poll questions. So our sorry, I need to share my screen. Yeah. So I'm hoping everyone can see my screen now. Yeah, as I mentioned, I'll be talking about simplifying database integration in Angular with Azure Static Web Apps. So our agenda is I'll just give an quick overview of what static web app is, and then we're gonna go to the main topic, which is Azure Data API Builder, and then I'm just gonna show you some pre-recorded demo afterwards, so you can see how you can also try it on your own. So what is Azure Static Web Apps? So Azure Static Web Apps is a service that allows you to automatically build and deploy full stack web apps to Azure from a code repository. So as you can see here in the image that I have in the screen, your code changes gets when you push your code changes to your repository, mainly GitHub um, and Azure DevOps. um, your pipeline will automatically trigger and deploy your application to Azure, where it supports your static content, mainly your images, assets, your HTML files, your JavaScript files. And then Azure Static Web Apps also supports Azure Functions or integrated API if ever you need one. So um, GitHub and Azure DevOps has a first-class integration with Azure Static Web Apps, but you can also use other repository or other version controls for storing your code bases and then integrate it with Azure Static Web Apps. There's just a little bit or a small difference in terms of how you do the deployment, but um, based from what I've seen, it's pretty straightforward as well because initially when they released Azure Static Web Apps, Azure only supported GitHub, at least out of the box, and then they just provided some workaround on how you can use Azure DevOps. So they kept that same implementation to other version control as well. Next is so there's a lot of features that has been implemented in Azure Static Web Apps over the years. Um, but the thing is, there's just some key features that I believe what make Azure Static Web Apps stand out among the rest or other like services out there. So name one is the web hosting for static content like as I mentioned, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and images. Um, you can host it in Azure Static Web Apps. And most of the key features that I'll share today are offered in free version, so you can really take full advantage of them. Um, Next one is the integrated API support provided by Azure Functions, with the options to like link an existing Azure Functions app, container apps, or using web API using a standard account. So for free pricing tier, Azure Functions is supported. You can also link existing Azure functions if you have an existing Azure Function API that you want to reuse in your Azure Static Web Apps. But if you want to use other than Azure Function, you have to use the standard account to like use your like Azure App Services, where it serves as your web API. Okay, so next is the CDN, Content Distributed Network. So what it does is it's globally distributed static content. Means putting content closer to your users. Um, Azure Static Web Apps automatically serve gzip as well, or broadly compressed version of your static assets if the client supports it. Client meaning the browser supports it, or like whatever devices the user is viewing your app is. So basically, it just with the CDN, it basically just makes your application load faster. So that's the small or the quick summary of CDN. So SSL, everybody loves SSL. In some hosting, you have to pay extra to get the SSL. So for those who are joining, like students that are new to this, so it's basically allows you to have your domain have an HTTPS. So it also makes your application a little bit secured. And in Azure Static Web Apps, they are offering SSL certificate for free. So which means you don't have to pay extra for this. And at the same time, Azure manages the SSL certificate for you, so you don't have to also worry about expiration of the certificate and then renewal configuration. The next thing that I really like is the custom domains. So of course, whenever we do like our portfolio site or like a demo application or just even an actual small application, we wanted to use our own branding. So custom domains we prefer having custom domains a lot. And with Azure Static Web Apps for the free version, you can use up to two um, custom domains per static web apps. And then if you upgrade your pricing plan to standard, because right now there's only two pricing plan for Azure Static Web Apps. It's the free and then the standard one. So if you upgrade, you get five custom domains. Next is the authentication. So Azure Static Web Apps supports has built-in authentication mechanism integrated to it. You don't have to do any backend coding in order for you to use them. So it has like GitHub authentication. It has Azure AD, which is now Microsoft Entra authentication. It has Twitter authentication built in. Um, and then I think they're also trying to have other social media or at least other famous authentication mechanism so be supported. And then if you again go to the standard pricing plan, you get the option to configure your custom provider that supports OpenID Connect. So if you like have like OAuth, um, which is you can do custom configuration, then you can also add it. But you have to be on the standard pricing plan. So just take note of that. So that's the overview for Azure Static Web Apps. Next is Azure Data API Builder. So Azure Data API Builder is an open source project under the MIT license. It is built by developers from Microsoft, and it's also maintained by developers from Microsoft as well. Um, but the most important part here is that it's open source, so you can use it in your enterprise application. It reduces the complexity involved in creating, managing, and deploying data APIs, which normally or usually takes some time. Making it very accessible for developers. So Data API Builder also supports different data sources, including, of course, the popular relational databases such as SQL Server, Azure SQL. It also supports NoSQL databases like Cosmos DB. And then they're trying to support MongoDB now. But yeah, so they have SQL Server, Azure SQL, Azure Cosmos DB for Azure's version of the NoSQL or non-relational database. And then MySQL, um, Cosmos DB for Postgres, and then what else? The relational Postgres SQL. So yeah, all those are being supported out of the box. Um, but if you can see in the illustration right here, you have your, let's see, my mouse is, so you have your front end application. This one is the Azure Function one, which is the optional. If ever, in case you want to have an integrated API in your front end application, so you don't have to build a separate solution or project for the API. You can have it. So for Azure Static Web Apps, you just have like the default directory is API folder. So you just create your Azure functions in that API folder, and then once you deploy it, it gets automatically detected. But if you put it in a different folder, your Azure functions, then you have to do extra configuration just to say, okay, this is where my APIs are located. But yeah, so this is optional if you're building static web apps, but because most of the time, people are just building like front end application, and then just take advantage of the key features that I just previously mentioned. And then Data API Builder was just recently introduced, which is again creates an abstraction layer between your front end, and it communicates directly to your database via different authentication mechanism, or the common way is just using a connection string, right? If you're a backend developer, you're building an API and then you want to access your database, the most common way is um, at least is setting up the connection string. So you can also do that. I'll show that in the demo later. Yeah, you can also do that. But the most, or the common practice nowadays, or at least the secured practice nowadays, is use the Microsoft integrated authentication to access database without having the connection strings at all. But yeah, going back to the illustration, your front end just um, connects directly to your API builder, and then your data API builder creates a virtual communication between your database, and then it pulls in the query that you want and return it. So again, I'll show that demo as well later. Next is, yeah, database connection is as I mentioned, it's a new feature that was introduced in static web apps, which makes it easier for you to connect your static web apps to your existing databases. Uh, the good thing here is it provides REST and GraphQL endpoints that will allow you to make CRUD requests to your database in without doing any coding, just pure configuration. So it supports NoSQL collections, supports for relational tables, views, and stored procedures. Supports multiple simultaneous data sources. You can have SQL Server, and then you can have non-relational like Cosmos DB or MariaDB or MongoDB, and then authentication via auth or JWT. So yeah, it's pretty handy for front-end developers if they want to do quick integration. So I'll be moving a bit fast now. The tooling that you need to start building your static web apps is, yeah, you need, if you're using Visual Studio Code extension, then you have to install Azure Functions. Again, this is optional if you want to build an API inside your front end. So this is optional. Next one is the Azure Static Web Apps. It helps you build um, your static web apps from your Visual Studio. And then again, this is optional. This just allows you to run and debug your Azure functions locally. Again, if you are building API using Azure functions within your front-end application. This is required. This is the Azure Static Web App CLI or command line tool. This is going to be installed in your machine globally with the -G there, which allows you to run your static web apps locally, including the API and the authentication emulator. I'll show that later as well in the demo video, so you can fully develop and run your apps locally. Um, I think the only requirements is, or dependency here is the Node.js. So you need to install Node.js. And then the command that you need in order to run your static web apps on your local machine is you just do SWA, which is the word for Azure Static Web Apps, or the keyword for Azure Static Web Apps, and then start, which is the command. And then you just say which directory do you want to grab the files from. Normally, if you're using Angular, whenever you build your Angular application, it goes directly to a distribution folder, and then the name of your application usually is the next folder. And then again, API location is optional, and you don't even have to include the API location if your default directory is also called API. But if it's something else, like let's say backend API, folder, then you have to explicitly include the folder here. And then the most, or what we'll be using in this demo is this one, SWA start, and then the folder directory, and then the data API location, which is um, the where the data API is gonna pull the configuration from. So it's gonna be in a SWA connections folder, and then there's gonna be a configuration file. So going on to the demo. So first you need to convert your application to, oops. So I made the demo so that you don't have to waste time waiting for me to um, build stuff. So first thing you need to do, so if you can see the screen, this is basically um, a very simple Angular application. Nothing very fancy here. You can do the same in. Forgot to mention, you can use Azure Static Web Apps and Data API Builder in other famous framework out there like React, Vue, or even just plain JavaScript with just plain HTML in it. You can do this, but I'm using Angular. Um, so I'm just gonna say in the command line SWA init yes, and then it will generate this SWA CLI config, which I'll be using later to like configure where the folder directory are. So you can see where the application is, the output location, the command for building it, for running it, and then the dev URL whenever you run it locally. So of course you can override those with your actual settings. Yeah. So next is initializing the database. So here I was saying SWA DB init, and then the type of database, as I mentioned, it supports SQL Server, Postgres, Cosmos, and MongoDB. You just have to put the data type here, and then you also have to put the connection string. If you don't want to put the connection string, um, I just put my connection string, but ideally it should supposed to be like the data source equals the local IP, the initial catalog with username and password. But here I just put my connection strings because it will generate the JSON files anyway, and then I can just copy paste my actual connection string and then put it there. So as you can see, after I executed it, it created the SWA DB connections folder. And then remember the command line that I mentioned earlier? It's pointing to SWADB connections folder. And then it will automatically look for this name, static web app database.config. If you change it, then you have to also modify it in your command line. But since I'm not changing the name, it's by default as is, then like that. So you can see here, I have the connection string. Again, you can override my connection string here with the actual connection string of your local database or your like cloud database server. And then you have here the option to, do you want to support REST API or do you want to support GraphQL? And then the path by default is /rest, and then for GraphQL, it's going to be /GraphQL. So now I'm just adding some entity on my configuration. So I'm just saying data API builder, add products, use the connection SWA connections folder, and use the config from um, static web app data API config JSON folder. And then the schema is dbo.products, which really exists in my database. So that needs to really exist. And then I'm just adding the permission that anyone can do a request on it. You'll see in the demo later. So anonymous asterisk means anyone can read it. So here you see it generated the entity products with the source DBO products. It's a type table, as I mentioned earlier. It supports view, it supports stored procedure, so you can also specify it. And then you said, please enable GraphQL here and please enable REST SQL here. And then the permission is anonymous role, which means anyone can access this endpoint. And then you see the asterisk. If you don't, just you can also granularly configure it. Like, okay, I only want anonymous for read access, but if someone like do a create command or do a create request, a delete request, or a put request, you can granularly configure each of those verbs to have, like, for create I want them to be admin, for delete I want them to be super admin. So but right now I've said just use asterisk, right, which means everyone can access this product. Yeah, so since I'm building locally, I'm just saying development mode, so that it actually pulls my connection string that I've configured. And I'm just starting the application, the dab start connection. And then again, I have to point out which configuration I need to use. Because as I mentioned, you can have multiple database sources. So each database sources can have configuration. So I'm going to localhost 500. And voila, you get a Swagger built in. You didn't have to do any configuration. If you're a backend developer, you have to install Swagger library or package and then configure that package in order for you to get this. With Azure Static Web Apps, you just say REST API, yes or true. Then once you run the application locally, you get this Swagger already integrated. You can see your endpoints for the products. You can see get product, put, patch, and delete automatically created for you. Yeah, I just did a run, and then you see it did pull some data, and those data are really coming from a database. So next one, I'm gonna show you that it supports GraphQL. You also have the query editor for GraphQL, where you can run your calls to GraphQL, do filters. Yeah, pretty handy, right? Almost done with the topic, so just bear with me for a little longer. So now I'm just gonna do um, build the entire application. So by default, you get this slash data API. Oops, sorry. Just 2 slides, and then I'll be done. So you just run the build, and then of course, by default, you get this slash data API. And then if you are gonna call from a REST endpoint, then you have to append the prefix REST and then the actual entity, which is the products entity from the config. And then the rest is whatever is required. But if you are using GraphQL, you have to put GraphQL here, not REST. So just a standard HTTP request in an Angular application. So on init, which means once the application loads, it pulls the data from the API endpoint. Okay, last slide. So I've also mentioned that Azure Static Web App supports built-in authentication. Um, so I'll just say, so yeah, let me just pause there for a little bit. So you can see here, auth login GitHub, auth login Twitter. Those are reserve links if you're using Azure Static Web Apps. If you use those links, it will automatically redirect you to the GitHub authentication page or to the Twitter authentication page, and then you can also use the that auth logout. So since I'm running locally, so I just said, as you can see here, I'm clicking each item, and then it calls the uh sorry. Yeah. So I did click each items, and then it did two requests and gave me 403 HTTP, which is forbidden, uh, because I removed the allow anonymous. So now I'm gonna log in with GitHub. Now if I click each item, this card should increase, and then um it should not, yeah, now it's returning to 01. Yeah. So sorry for the short time. So that's it for my talk. Um, I hope everyone learned a lot or got interested at least in um, using Azure Static Web Apps and try out the features that I've mentioned. I'll try to share. I have a repository. I'll if you go to my GitHub page, I'll upload the demo that I just showed you, so you can play around with it as well, and then maybe you can host it in your own um, Azure services, and then configure it. Well, I think I still have quite some time. Then I'll just do. Um, Let me see if I can share my demo up. This is the old one. Let me see. Just gonna grab the URL. I'm gonna stop sharing and share a different screen. So this app doesn't have the functionality of the add to cart functionality, but it does have the login functionality, I believe, to GitHub and Twitter. Remember when in the slide, in the previous slide, what happened here? Yeah. So in the previous slide, you just saw like a dummy login for GitHub. So that dummy login is also provided by Azure Static Web Apps, CLI or tooling for you locally, so you can play around with it and like simulate the actual authentication. But once you deploy it, it will automatically use the actual auth providers authentication page. So as you can see, this in the link below in the lower left, you just see the link is the same. It's just slash that auth slash login to GitHub, and then once I go there, it will actually use the authentication provider for it. So I'm not gonna use it because I'm using the company laptop right now. But yeah, and then of course you need to also have extra configuration if you want to make the application exclusive. Let's say, for example, you have your own organization in GitHub. Okay, this is my organization, and I want the the people under this organization are the only ones who can access the application, even though they are authenticated. Then you can also do that, and you just have to update the uh, SWA connection configuration and add the organization key, the auth provider keys and stuffs. So those things are a little bit advanced for us for this introduction and overview. So I'm not gonna touch that. But yeah, again, if you visit, or at least by tomorrow, if you visit the repository that I have, um, or just visit my repository, I'll upload the complete version of the application. So I'm gonna share again my screen. Yeah, so you just go to GitHub /JessMaghuyo, and then by tomorrow it should be there. It should have the at least the add to cart functionality, so you can also try it out on your local machine. And then I also add a screenshot of what the database schema looks like, so you can also try to build it locally, and then you can play around with the connections and stuffs. Okay, uh, that's it for my call.
All right, thank you, Sir Jezreel. So, why don't we show our appreciation to Sir Jezreel by clicking those emojis? So, share your hearts, your claps. All right, I'm seeing many claps here. Thank you so much. All right, thank you. So, we have a lot of questions here for you, sir. So, let me start with the first one. So, the first question is from an anonymous attendee. So the question is, many developers are familiar with using tools like Firebase for backend as a service. How does integrating a database with Azure static web apps compare in terms of ease of use, scalability, and cost of effectiveness for Angular applications?
Sure. So in terms of the scalability, since if you're building an enterprise application, and nowadays most databases are in the cloud, and then they act as a separate entity over to your other application, unlike the old days that you have a virtual machine and then you have everything in a virtual machine. So in terms of scalability in Azure, at least in Azure, you can have the configuration to scale out up and down your database, add more resources to your database server in terms of the um, on how many um, like how many concurrent users it can allow. So you just have to go to the database server in Azure and then make sure it's properly scaled. Cost effectiveness, as I mentioned, most of the things that in the Azure Static Web Apps are free. The only thing the only time that you need to consider uh, paid um, the standard pricing is, of course, if you're building enterprise, you'll definitely gonna need the standard. You have a custom auth provider that you want to implement. What else? Uh, it gives you so for free version, um, there's a bandwidth um, for free version. I forgot how many usage per month. There's a quota for free, and once you reach that, I think it's like 100 gig per subscription per month. And once you reach that bandwidth, um, for the free version, your app is gonna be it will stop being available in the public. Azure will stop it. But if you're using the standard, you'll just have to pay for the extra. per gig. So I forget the how much it is. Um, you can find it in the pricing details of Azure Static Web Apps in the Azure website. And I also remember now that they are rolling out a new pricing tier, which is dedicated for enterprise application. So before it's just free and standard, and now they have, I believe it's called dedicated. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on this, but you should see that in the pricing page of um, Azure Static Web Apps. I'm not familiar with the details yet, but I remember it's like around the same number of bandwidth for all, so free, standard, and the dedicated, same bandwidth, same, I think, uh, overage. There's just more benefits to it. Yeah, which I forgot. I think the domain, custom domains, you have 10, I think, but who will need that, right? But yeah, but there's a lot of benefits to it.
All right, thank you for that great answer, Sir Jasriel. So moving on to our second question. This is also from an anonymous attendee. So the question is, can you compare or somehow give us a simple pros and cons of Angular against other FE framework?
It's kind of hard, but um, okay. So compared to other frameworks, I think people usually say this in the industry, right? Uh, Angular is built for enterprise application, but I'm not saying that other frameworks are not built for can't be used for enterprise application, because React is being used by a lot of companies in enterprise application. I think the only thing that tech devs used to quote on when they say enterprise application is that for enterprise application, it's definitely gonna be a large app, right? It's gonna have scalability. And out of the box, Angular provides you most of the or almost everything you need to build an application, so you don't have to worry about the routing, what routing I'm going to use, what state management I'm going to use. um, what else, like unlike other frameworks out there that so of course Angular is very opinionated, but it doesn't mean that you can't import other libraries to your benefits. The other thing is, compared to other frameworks, Angular has a little bit, or I'd say, hard learning curve compared to other framework that are easy to learn. But that's what the Angular team is trying to do over the past 2 years. So they are trying to simplify things so that they invite more and more entry level developers to look at and at least try Angular for what it is. One example is they simplified creating the components. They removed the modules, starting in Angular 18, or at least I think coming right now, the 19 version. When you start creating Angular application, it will be by default gonna be used standalone, so you don't have to worry about the other stuffs like modules. So yeah, I think right now Angular, the goal of Angular team is to make Angular developer friendly for entry level. So they invite more and more and more people using it.
All right, thank you, Sir Jasriel. So our next question is from Maria Pasang. So the question is, how does the automatic CI or CD pipeline of Azure Static Web Apps support database updates?
So as I've said, um, the database is totally separate from the Azure Static Web Apps. Azure Static Web Apps with the data API builder integrated in it just creates a small connection between um, the database and your front end. Um, in terms of the pipeline, since they are separate, you can also have a configure your CI/CD pipeline to, okay, build the front end, build static web apps, and then on the next job or next step, you can have a dedicated task for it for the database updates. So that's totally doable. But in reality, they're totally separate application. And of course, I wouldn't suggest. I'm not a DevOps guy, but I know a little bit of DevOps stuff. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't have a pipeline for static web apps and then have a separate job to execute the database update. I wouldn't do that. I'll just have two different pipelines, for one dedicated for static web apps and then one dedicated for the database.
All right, thank you, Sir Jasriel. So, uh, this is another question from an anonymous attendee. So the question is, which database technology do you advise and prefer for beginners and non-technical users?
Uh, I think the at least okay. So it depends. I would suggest, if you're a front end guy, or if you're a front end developer, you're most likely familiar with JSON. Then I would suggest go with non-relational type databases like Cosmos DB, MongoDB, or Firebase. Um, but most of the time, backend developer, even of course, back in the day, the backend developers by default uses a relational database, which is commonly used SQL Server, MySQL, and then Postgres is very famous nowadays. So yeah, it depends on what you like, I guess. So if you like JSON, then go with Cosmos DB, MongoDB. But if you like relational database, then go with the traditional ones.
All right. So the next question is, is this the same as Firebase?
I'm not really familiar with. I've used Firebase before, but I'm not really knowledgeable enough to say the comparison. So yeah.
All right, Booster. So let's move on to the next question. This is also from Jed. So, do we need any back-end language experience for this?
No, that's the beauty of it, right? So if you want to, uh, most of the time, this is what happens in actual development, right? You are a front end guy, and there's a back end guy. You build your front end task, and then somehow you can't finish your task because you're waiting for a front end developer to build the API, so you can do the actual integration between front end and back end. So this kind of eliminates that a little bit, but at the same time, it's case to case basis. Why did I say that? It's case to case basis because if you're just gonna like pull data from a database, send data to the database, then data API builder is um, really good. But most of the time, there's complex logics happening behind it, right? You have to implement like complex uh, business logic in the back end before you actually persist the data, right? And so again, if you're building an app that has or zero or little business logic, or if all of the business logic can be done in the front end, then yeah, I would suggest just go with the data API builder, um, utilize it. But if you have like complex business logic that needs to run on a different process, then that's where the backend will come in. And the second point is, if you're building a microservice application, then it's really ideal to have a separate backend that many front ends can connect into. So yeah.
All right, thank you, sir. So, moving on to the next question. This is from Jan Daniel Paragas. So, the question is, in terms of performance, how does Azure SWA handle database queries and what techniques can be employed to optimize response time?
So you don't really have to do any like select statement, where clause in your Angular application, or I should stop saying Angular application, in your front end. Um, you don't really have to do any of those queries at all. What you need to do is just create a HTTP service. I'm referring to Angular now, or React, you use Axios, right? You do HTTP calls. So you just build this. You just have to do a HTTP call to your data API REST endpoint or GraphQL endpoint, and provide the necessary payload or parameter to call that endpoint successfully. And then data API builder, which is again an abstraction layer, will convert those requests from the endpoint, build your query, and then uh, request it to directly to your database.
All right, thank you for that wonderful answer, sir. So let's move on to our next question. This is also from an anonymous attendee. So the question is, Azure static web apps promote a Jamstack approach. What are some limitations or considerations to keep in mind when integrating complex database interactions, which might traditionally require server-side logic within this architecture?
Sorry. Azure Static promotes a Jamstack approach. Yes, that's true. What are some limitations or considerations to keep in mind? Can you scroll down a bit? Some limitations to keep in mind. Oh, I can see. I thought it was your screen. So considerations to keep in mind when integrating complex database interaction. So I'm not sure what you mean by complex database interaction, but I'm guessing it's probably the same thing as I mentioned earlier, that if you have like really complex business logic that should probably run on a separate process. As you know, front-end framework or JavaScript is single-threaded, right? You can't have very um, resource-intensive process running in your front end, because otherwise your application is gonna freeze, or at least your performance will gonna drop. So again, if you have those, then definitely go to backend. What was the other one? Which material was Yeah, I think that's my answer to that.
All right, thank you, sir. So I hope that answered your question to our anonymous attendee. So the next question is from Kim John de Fiesta. So the question is, how can developers implement effective safeguards such as authentication, authorization, and input validation to prevent vulnerabilities while maintaining high performance and scalability with REST or GraphQL?
So I already answered it in a previous question, but as I've said, you don't have to really write any queries. You just have to call the endpoints, provide the payload none needed for you to successfully execute those endpoint or HTTP calls. For input validation, it's a common practice that both front end and back end, if you have like two separate front end and back end application, that you sanitize your properties or fields. Um, there's a common rule that we have in development, right? Don't trust your users. So yeah, you have to always sanitize it, encode, decode the property or the values that are being sent to the endpoints. What else? But if you're worried about like SQL injection, I don't think that's gonna happen if you're using Data API Builder. Who knows? There might be some workaround out there. What was the other part of the question? Sorry, I couldn't see it. Can you pull it up again?
Sure.
Sorry.
Uh, do you want me to read, sir, or do we just flash it on the screen?
Can you flash it on the screen? Sorry.
All right.
Uh, uh, oh, yeah. You asked about securing data access. So as I mentioned, you have this granular. You have this configuration that you can configure each endpoints granularly. You can allow anonymous access. You can allow specific roles for specific endpoints, but by just configuring this JSON file configuration. And then, of course, connection strings are not going to be available. So here's the thing. When you push your code to a repository, make sure to remove the connection string um, from the configuration file. Okay, make sure to do that, because once you go to Azure portal, you go to your Azure Static Web Apps. There's a menu there that says databases. And then once you click that, it will show you a list of available database that you have in Azure. And then you can just select, okay, this is my e-commerce database. I'm going to select this. And then what Azure does, it will automatically updates that configuration file for you, add the connection strings into your static web apps, and they'll make the connection. So at least the front end and database connection is secure that way. There's no connection string exposed. You can granularly add role-based authentication to your API endpoints. You can have for the entire entity, which is product entity, or you can have per endpoint, like for create, like I mentioned earlier. For create, you have different role access. For delete, you have different role access by just adding this configuration. Okay.
I think that's the last question we can accommodate, sir, due to I am afraid our time is up. So thank you once again, Sir Justreal, for answering the question. Now, in case you guys still have questions, feel free to chat with our speakers. So I know you still have many, many questions for Sir Justreal, so you may reach out to him via our AirMeet chat. So that's all the time that we have for this session. If you enjoyed this session, please give your rating and share your feedback about our speaker. You'll find the link in the chat box. So again, let's thank Sir Justreal by clicking on the heart and clapping emojis. All right. Thank you so much. You may now exit this session. I think this is the last session for today. So it has been a great time learning along with you. So we hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much. You may now exit the session. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Welcome to Avaloq, the #1 provider of software and services for wealth managers and private banks. Founded in 1985, we now have over 4 trillion in Swiss francs assets managed on our systems, 17 offices, in 10 countries, with more than 2,500 employees across the globe, and 25% of annual revenue spent on R&D. We build long-lasting relationships with our client community. And we're proud of our 100% record of successful client implementations. By sharing our investment in innovation, development and regulatory initiatives, we unlock more value for our community. We enable our clients to grow their business and increase efficiency and speed. Our clients have used our solutions to simplify their administrative burden, increasing revenue per relationship manager by up to 10%. Through automation, we have delivered STP rates for payments of up to 99.8% for our clients. And our flexible and modular architecture allows clients to expand rapidly into new markets. We offer a range of innovative solutions from front to back office. And we also support the back office with banking operations. Avaloq's open, highly scalable architecture is built on a unified data model, providing a single source of truth for all client and transaction data. With our multi-entity, single-instance approach and market-specific standard editions, clients can easily expand their business. Our products integrate seamlessly with our clients' own applications or third parties, and our customization layers give clients flexibility while maintaining many of the benefits of standardization. Everything we do supports our mission to orchestrate the financial ecosystem and democratize access to wealth management.